Hey, Matt, people always hear me say this is one of the most uh, important questions or fun questions I have also. And if anybody's seen lots of my videos, I always tell the story, even when I speak, about my first influencer, who, by the way, can come in a moment in time or a lifetime or anything in between. But my first influencer was my grandfather, my grandmother, my mom, my aunt came from Kiev and they came to Montreal. And when I was 5 or 6, my grandfather used to take me to the park and we hung out and we were walking. And I'd ask him one day, I called him Zeta. I said, Zeta, how do you know all these people that you talk to? You talk to everybody, which is probably where I get it from. And he said, well, one day I was walking and I smiled at this person and he walked over and smiled back at me. And then he started talking to me. So I talked to him. And then while we were doing that, another person came over, saw us smiling, and he came over and smiled at us. And it was like fascinating to me as a 5 or 6 year old that something as simple as a smile made him that many friends. And then, and influenced each other along the way. Then as I got older, I started really to see the real advantage of being an influencer and that we're all influencers in one way or another. So with that little story, can you share with us? I know there's probably plenty, 2 or 3 people that have been influential in your life.
Yeah, sure. Another great question. Well, my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, is definitely kind of on that list for sure. I think my grandmother and my grandfather as well, but my grandmother was always kind of like a safe place and like a source of comfort for me when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents when I was a child, and it was always like like a fun place to be. It's like an enjoyable time. Like some people don't have that, but it was really nice for me. And like I remember going to their apartment, and my grandfather taught me to play poker, and like it was like which I still suck at poker actually, but I always suck. But it was a good skill to pick up. But it was always like of comforting, enjoyable experience. Like I never like dreaded going there or anything like that. It was great. But I always knew I was like safe and comfortable in my grandmother's arms, if you will. My
Did
grandmother
did
died
she
of
make potato latkes as good as my grandmother did?
I never had potato latkes with my grandmother. My paternal grandparents were fully Americanized for a long time. My grandmother's family came here to the States during the Civil War, the American Civil War in the 1860s.
Mm.
And so by the time, she became my grandmother in the, 1980s, they'd been here for 6 generations. So by that point, they're just as American as anyone. So, my maternal grandparents came over probably closer to when your family came over in the 1920s. So for
Right,
them, it was a little bit more of that kind of like, from the old country kind of experience, if you will.
right.
But with my paternal grandparents, it was not that case at all. So it was much more like uh, American, if you will. But my grandmother, she died of breast cancer when I was a junior in high school, and when when it first happened, it was like kind of like uh, a fire drill type of thing, where like all of a sudden she was sick and then she wasn't with us anymore. And like it wasn't like a long drawn out thing, thank God for her. But at the time it was very sudden for me. She was there and then she wasn't there almost like in a matter of weeks. Um, and I actually delivered the eulogy at her funeral, and I wrote it and delivered it, and I was, I guess, tearful at the time, but that was important to say a few words at that time. Looking back, it did kind of spur me on the path towards going into science, going to molecular and cellular biology, which I later pursued. But it also, I realized later that the way that she kind of was cared for, or the way that her clinicians kind of engaged her as a patient, was really not appropriate at all. And it was also kind of part of what got me into life sciences as a discipline, because she was, I grew up about an hour east of New York City, and she saw a primary care doctor out in that area. And even though she had advanced cancer and probably should have been referred to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where my wife is now a senior director, uh, for some reason they kept her as a local patient in the community setting, and she unfortunately passed away, maybe before her time. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I don't know why that went that way. It just seemed kind of strange to me in retrospect when I was in my, later kind of life as an adult. And a lot of my time, like a lot of my professional career has been trying to focus on closing the gap between what the science knows is possible and what people actually do, what clinicians actually do in practice. So that I think, that my grandmother's experience, her death, and then what followed was really kind of a kind of touch point for me.
Well, yeah. Yeah, thank you for
There, I
sharing.
have there are other people I can think of as influencers as well, but I think that was probably the most kind of sentinel, if you will, for me. I mean, I think, I mentioned when we spoke before that Peter Diamandis is like a kind of
Yeah.
academic or kind of a thought leader influencer for me. I've like followed all his work, most of my recent kind of career over the last decade or so, and I just think the disposition of what's possible from an emerging technology perspective is so important for people that are contributing to organizations, to audiences, to groups that are trying to think about how to progress forward and to move away from this like scarcity mindset and think about how to kind of make the future possible, if you will. And I religiously kind of follow Peter's work in that regard. My other kind of third influencer, if I can get a third, would be uh, King Alfred, the first king of England, would be my influencer. I've read, I mean, I know some people are like British royals, kind of followers, but
Right.
the current alive royals. I read a lot about like the original founding of England, like back in the 900s and perhaps even earlier than that. And Alfred was really amazing as both a statesman but also as a visionary. Like, but Alfred united the clans and built the vision of England before England existed as a single entity. And he did so at a time when most of what was Angleland, of most of the landmass of England, was overrun by Saxons and by the Vikings, if you will. And he did so while battling a very serious physical illness. He was pretty much ill 60-70% of the time. He was not well and he was in pain most of the time. But he still was able to manage and take care of his family. He was able to build essentially the vision of England and bring together the groups and essentially create what became one of the biggest and most important empires in modern history. So it was probably one of my idols. I had never met him, obviously, but it's
I figured.
on my list.
Well, it does show us that, especially in these times that you're talking about, where there's going to be abundance and superabundance, and we can't be afraid of it and not hang on to scarcity and really do, what we don't maybe even think is possible to make it happen. We get people are always influencing other people, even if they were in the 900s, or you talk to somebody on the street and you don't even think about influencing them, but you may be a little bit, or you may be a big influence just because of right time, right place. So I think it's important for all of us to kind of realize that you don't have to be focused on, I'm making an influence, but you have a choice to be positive or negative, and it doesn't, it hurts. It takes a lot more muscles to frown than smile, as they say. So why not smile? But thanks a million for sharing all that. And thanks for being an influencer. And thanks for being a leader who cares. We can all be that if we want to in our own different ways. So really appreciate it.
No, thanks again for the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for having me on.